This is Billy Kay with the history of Scottish nationalism told from within the movement, the cause. Programme 5, A Very Special Place.
The SNP should always remember Compton Mackenzie's words in his rectoral address to Glasgow University. We, now alive in Scotland, are offered the grace of sharing in the rebirth of our nation. It is a grace, an extraordinary privilege. I say we should embrace it with both hands and our whole heart.
I think Scotland will become independent. I've no doubt about that. I believe that completely. I've never deviated.
It only became feasible when they created a Scottish Parliament. And Blair, a lot of people may remember him for Iraq, but I would say he'll be remembered for an independent Scotland.
It may be the case that when historians look back, they might see the advent of devolution as marking the beginnings of independence. In the same way that people would date Irish independence, is they would talk about either 1916 or 1922, because that starts the process. So in some sense, I think we've already sort of kind of passed the threshold of what, to all intents and purposes, people in the future will look back and say, 1997, that's when Scotland becomes independent.
Professor Richard Finlay of Strathclyde University, Jim Lynch, Flora McCormick and Winnie Ewing on the prospect of an independent Scotland brought about by the coming of a Scottish Parliament. Now, from as early as the 12th century, when proclamations addressed the French, English, Scots and Flemish inhabiting our towns, Scottish nationalism has been civic rather than ethnic, and any group expressing exclusivity has been excluded. Fergus Ewing, Humza Yousaf, Peter Wright and Dr Peter Lynch of Stirling University.
You've had parties in Belgium, Italy, Germany, and obviously particularly France with the Front National, talking about immigration and identity and everything else. And that particular strand hasn't actually really gone anywhere within Scotland. And it's always quite surprising when you explain to people in other countries what the nationalists do, and they had the first Asian MSP, etc., etc. People find that quite surprising.
At various times there have been various groups in the party. No long before I joined, there was the 55 group,
which was Anglophobic in its publicity and, as far as its doctrines were concerned, had some very strange origins, including Mein Kampf,
which got dealt with by expulsion. And then there was the 1320 group.
There were people who dabbled with shield and guile, which was a Jacobite thing, prancing around in kilts and carrying broadswords.
They liked marching and they had armbands. Now, nobody who's lived through the war years is going to look at folk marching about with armbands and feel any pleasure. So the Shield, eventually it was ruled their membership could not coincide with membership of the party. It's a vanishingly small problem in modern times just because of the enormous growth and strength of the main body. But when we were struggling, you could not afford to have this kind of idiocy.
These people, you were almost like felt that were invented either by Compton Mackenzie and the British Secret Service to justify themselves. I remember way back in the 70s there was an alleged attempt by the Scottish National Liberation Army to blow up the Clyde Tunnel, and it was a daft wee boy in a dug setting off fireworks or something, but it was all blown out of proportion. But there is, of course, the nutcase side in anything. But no doubt as we move in a certain direction, these facets will come out of the woodwork, both from the Unionist side and from the Nationalist side.
Well, I was involved in clamping down on the microscopic organisation that was Settler Watch or Scottish Watch, in as much as it ever existed at all. Everybody in the party agreed that we had to make it absolutely clear that the SNP had no truck with this behaviour, and anyone who made racist comments about the English or anyone else would be expelled from the SNP.
Racism occurs in Scotland, of course it does, and sectarianism is still rife. So there are problems, But nobody's ever really asked me, are you Muslim or are you Scottish? Which one are you? Because they accept your identity. Scotland is, as was famously said by William McIlvany, it's a mongrel nation, you know. So there's not been that tension, which is very different to a lot of South Asians that live south of the border, partly because English nationalism and British nationalism has just been hijacked by the far right, by the British National Party, by the English Defence League. We've had a civic nationalism which has not been based on ethnicity.
In the North East, because of the oil industry, there are a lot of English people. In some areas like here, it might be 30% of the population. But they realise the future for them and their children lies in a prosperous, well-managed Scotland. And the support we're getting from that community is absolutely incredible.
I welcome input-comers, Billy, who want to contribute. We've got the example of the Poles. You know, in 1610, so many Scots went to Poland that the Scots who were in Gdansk wrote to King James VI begging him not to allow any more Scots into Poland because we, the Scots, were taking over the Poles. The upshot today is that Poles are coming to Scotland and I welcome them. What a work ethic they've got. They're also beautiful looking people who are great with their hands and their minds. And I meet them and I remind them and I tell them this story and I say, you're probably just returning Scots.
Gordon Casely, John Mackay and Gordon Wilson reminding us that history often repeats itself. And perhaps more so in a country where, according to Robert Louis Stevenson, the Scot cherishes the memory of his forebears, good and bad, and there burns alive in him a sense of identity with the dead, even to the 20th generation. Professor Allan MacInnes of Strathclyde University on a remarkable modern echo from the politics of the 18th century.
In 2007, when the Nationalists were a minority government, but effectively a majority party, if you look at their constituency and the constituency support, it was very similar to the Scottish support for the 1715 Rising. And clearly, Salmon has led his troops to greater success than Mar did at Sheriff Muir.
Episcopalianism was the strongest pro-Jacobite force in Scotland. If you look at some of the broadswords that were used at that time, what Episcopalians were carrying was a picture of King James etched just below the hilt. Underneath that it said, "For King James, for Scotland, and no union."
Father Emsley Nimmo on the Scottish Episcopal Church and its nationalist traditions. As for that Union of 1707, in the words of Sir Walter Scott, read here by Paul Scott, there was very little support for it beyond the few who were personally enriched by its passage.
Despised by the English and detested by their own country, fettered, as Lord Belhaven expressed it, by the golden chain of equivalence, the Unionists had lost all freedom of remonstrance and had no alternative left save that of fulfilling the unworthy bargain they had made.
Here we all they are, our Scottish fame, fair we lure range and glory. Fair we all even take our Scottish name, say famed in martial story.
They were bride perhaps more to stay solidly with Union rather than to switch their vote. But what is really the factor was the incompetence of the Scots who negotiated the Union. It was a really bad deal. A parcel of rogues is a better way than, say, a parcel of numpties, but you could argue that was more the factor.
Sick a parcel of rogues in a nation.
In these negotiations, the Scottish side was actually chosen by the Queen, that's to say by the English government. And when they got to London, they were not allowed to discuss anything except the English proposal. They just had to do what they were told. So Burton sold for English gold.
Sick a parcel of rogues in a nation.
And Burns kent what he was writing about, because by Jove, have we no been bought and sold, no just in his time, but afore and since, for English gold.
For nationalists, almost 3 centuries of wrong only began to be righted in 1999 when Winnie Ewing uttered these historic words.
The Scottish Parliament, adjourned on 25th March 1707, is hereby reconvened.
The return of the Parliament was achieved by organisations across civic Scotland, from Common Cause to the Constitutional Convention, and by a successful cross-party campaign, which this time united Labour, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens and the SNP. But it was the Nationalists who gained most from what was a seismic shift in the Scottish political landscape.
More SNP members were elected in 1999 to the Scottish Parliament than had ever been elected to parliamentary public office in the party's history up until then. It became a very different political party. It wasn't a fringe party, it wasn't a tiny wee group of MPs in the House of Commons. It now was an alternative party of government, and that transforms the SNP.
It's just so different from what there is now, because you can't really have arguments between gradualists and fundamentalists anymore in the SNP because devolution's happened. So the big thing they would have argued about, is it a blockage, is it going to help us? Well, it's there now.
We're going to accept this Parliament, we're going to get control of it and run it to independence. But again, the point of the whole thing was, again, it was designed to stop us, but the Scottish people just didn't have to think that was right.
I never once voted for a winning candidate until this past election. I was absolutely thrilled, aged 68, and I actually had voted for a winner for the first time. I felt, for the first time, politically enfranchised.
In terms of national identity, I mean, people are much more confident about being Scottish. Scottish is accepted as something being much more natural. When I was doing my PhD in the late 1980s, I was told point blank my book would never get published because it was on the Scottish National Party. Whereas today, it's pretty mainstream, it's pretty much the norm.
I think Scots have become much more relaxed about being Scots, much more confident in who we are as Scots, and that's also reflected in the SNP.
Professor James Mitchell of Strathclyde University. The confidence that came with power over domestic affairs also led to increasing demands for power over Scotland's international role. Alex Salmond, Humza Yousaf and former chairman of the SNP, Jimmy Halliday.
I have always felt that Scotland has got, just as it's got social attitudes that differentiate it, so also it has diplomatic attitudes that differentiate it.
I was growing up as a Muslim in Glasgow during the 9/11 period. That was really the day that changed the world for me and probably changed the world for a lot of people. I was 16 years old at the time. Scotland had a choice really, especially as the events unfolded in the next couple of years. Say, for example, for me it was the Iraq War.
If you're not independent, you cannot prevent your involvement in these foreign wars because you do not have the legal constitutional power to exclude yourself.
Seeing somebody like Alex Salmond speak so eloquently, when I watched him speak in the Commons debate against the Iraq War and the passion with which he delivered it, and I said, that's the kind of Scotland I want to see. And that to me showed that actually Scotland is different in its values.
I think there's also been an awareness, if you take Tony Blair's premiership and the war in Iraq, and people draw all sorts of conclusions from that disastrous experience, but one conclusion that we might draw is it's really quite important to be in charge of foreign affairs, defence, as well as being in charge of whether or not you have a poll tax. So things have happened to Scotland which have perhaps changed people's inclination. So Scotland has changed, but I think the essence of it is the SNP has changed. I mean, the SNP looks and hopefully behaves and will continue to work and behave like the party that Scotland would like to be governed by. Above all, optimistic, idealistic about the country, pragmatic about getting progress for the country, and looking forward to how to make the country better. It's very difficult to resist the enthusiasm of a combination of idealism and pragmatic performance. The SNP, of course, mustn't get careless in their appreciation of that. Every party has support by consent. But if people think your heart's in the right place and you know what you're doing, you've got the right people, they'll forgive you a great deal. If they believe your heart's in the wrong place and you've not got the right people, they won't forgive you anything.
The herd eyes the paired eye that Max his Richter ran.
Correct.
The First Minister accentuating the positive. Opponents find his swagger too pronounced, his optimism too idealistic. But compared to the low expectation, sense of victimhood and negativity that produced the Scottish cringe in the past, most Scots are now at home with positivity. For historian Fiona Watson, this simply means going back to our roots.
To always see ourselves as the victims of the Southern English is not to take responsibility, and if you don't take responsibility, you can't have pride. I would like very much to see the Scottish identity take on what it has been for most of its history, which was very positive. We were remarkable in so many ways and punched above our weight, very can-do, and for me that's what Bruce represents. You know, here's a man who, yes, was ambitious, but who, when it came down to it, proved more than equal to anything that anyone could throw at him. Let's look at success. Let's look at projecting a powerful image of ourselves to ourselves first and then out. And I think that that would actually be a better representation of Scottish history, all told, than the one we've had more recently.
Let me tell you that I love you, that I think about you all the time. Caledonia, you're calling me, and now I'm going home. And if I should become a stranger, you know that it would make me more than sad. Caledonia's been everything I've ever had.
Sing it loud, I'm Scots and I'm proud. Dougie MacLean's Caledonia, sung by Frankie Miller. What a contrast to compatriots of the past like James Boswell, who, when he was introduced to the Scotophobe Dr. Johnson, apologised for his national origins, saying, "I do indeed come from Scotland, but I cannot help it." The cringe no longer thrives, but it does survive. Rennie McCowan, Tom Nairn and Jim Mitchell.
Some of the criticism you hear of the SNP and the silly comments that are made about this tartan-clad party and all the rest of it, I often think those comments say more about the person who's making the criticisms than the SNP itself. And it strikes me that some of the criticisms we hear are an example of the Scottish cringe. So in a funny kind of way, there is, I think, an argument to be made that the last remnants of the Scottish cringe can be found at least amongst an element of that hardline fundamentalist unionist outlook.
They try to use the term the British nation. There is no British nation. There is a British state.
There will still be fossils of the ancien regime in the British Isles who want to carry on it, and that's why the United Kingdom has become the hanging around state. It can't reinvent an imperial purpose or a new significance for itself. All it can do is hang about.
Is it possible to not believe in independence and still believe passionately in Scotland? Absolutely, of course it is. And there's many honourable people in that position. But in that position, I mean, if I didn't believe in independence, I would still want to see Scotland do well. I would want Scots to have the confidence to say no to independence for the right reasons, as opposed to be dragooned into some fear-laden, doom-ridden atmosphere of they didn't think they could. And that's what's at stake. But you see, things, in my view, have gone beyond that. I think a lot of folk in Scotland have passed that psychological tipping point where they're prepared to accept this nonsense anymore, and a lot more are getting there. And therefore, I think there's a momentum which is leading in a certain direction. I can't claim to know absolutely what the timetable is even now, but I'm pretty certain the destination is set.
And I've had enough of being told I'm too small or too stupid or too weak. I've had enough of people saying, you know, we're too daft, but at the same time, we're full of such hubris because, you know, we're the guys that invented penicillin, tarmac and television, don't you know? Oh, and cloning and nanotechnology. But, we're a bit too poor and a bit too weak. So I would like to see a Scotland that's confident and that recognises its potential. A Scotland that's tartan is diverse, and I think our diversity is a strength. Ultimately, a Scotland that has the powers by which to control its own destiny. Lastly, I'm a great believer in that saying that a country's greatness is not measured by its military strength or by its wealth, but by how it treats its most vulnerable. And I'd like to see a Scotland that lived by that motto.
I think an independent Scotland would be a caring Scotland, because I think that's in the Scottish character too. And I can see a genuine pride of nation without anything untoward happening. I think maturity is there now. It wasn't always.
Scotland has become a place where policies defending welfare state remain very important. That clearly isn't the case in other parts of the UK. And we have this wonderful paradox that the SNP, probably more than any political party operating in Britain today, is the leading champion of this welfare state, this very British set of institutions. Now, the way to defend it appears to be to have a Scottish independent state.
The irony of an independent Scotland promising to preserve core British icons like the National Health Service, while those institutions are eroded elsewhere. One of a number of reasons attracting non-nationalists to the cause. Derek Maguire.
A lot of people try to characterise it as based on romanticism. It's nothing other than straightforward pragmatism for me. I believe that we're all under a duty to make sure that our bairns have a better outlook than we had in our time. And I just don't think that by giving all our money away to Westminster to let Westminster decide how much of our money they're going to give us back is ever going to allow us to provide the kind of outlook that we have the potential to provide for our bairns. The only thing that will let us maximise our potential is independence.
There has never been a time when I've never thought of myself other as a nationalist or wanted to be any other persuasion. What is more astonishing now is that the number of people nowadays for whom believing in this goal is quite normal. It's no more abnormal than the hosts of nations throughout the globe for whom independence is just part of daily life.
I think so long as people in Scotland believed that the UK state was successful, they would have stuck to it, especially if they felt that their identity as Scots was still protected within that state. But when the state is seen to be perhaps less successful, then questions of loyalty come in. Of course, there will be an emotional element to an identity, but they're also quite rational. People aren't going to support the breakup of a state if they feel that they would be a lot worse off, but they might be willing to switch loyalties to a Scottish state if they feel that state would deliver for them and they would be better off.
What's the future of Britain look like if it's a Conservative government? And that's a problem for Labour in particular. And the way to understand that is you ask yourself a simple question, which is, when did the Conservatives last get in power? Oh, 1979. How long did that last? And then you come up with a staggering number of 18 years. And that's a real problem for opponents of change. I mean, that's going to be a very difficult thing to sell if you're Labour or the Liberal Democrats trying to oppose the issue of independence or Devo Max.
Measured academic views from historians Peter Lynch and Jim Mitchell. But over at Murrayfield, there's passion in the anthem. And back at Bannockburn, nationalists know how far the cause has come in their own lifetime.
We were pariahs then, but we struggled through and we're here, you know, and we'll never go away until we get what is ultimately our destiny, and that is independence.
John Maclean made a speech in 1911 where he said the times we live in are so stirring and full of change that it's not impossible to believe we're in the rapid revolution. And I believe this to be a really stirring, exciting time. I'm here because I've always been in the John Maclean tradition. John Maclean was for a Scottish Workers' Republic. He always had in his banner, all hail the Scottish Workers' Republic. That won't happen without independence. For me, it is all hail the Scottish Workers' Republic, all hail an independent Scotland.
They'll come out with the same distortions and lies and fear tactics to try and scare off the Scots. I'm confident at this stage we'll manage to surmount that, and that whatever happens at the end of the day, out of it, Scotland will have more control, more self-respect, and we will go on from there to be a proper nation.
I would hope that would come within the next 10 years. I doubt I'll be here to see it. It's a thought that maybe after a lifetime of eggling for independence and encouraging folk to feel Scottish and all the rest of it. And you'll notice I say feel Scottish. No anti on anything, but feel Scottish and be proud of it. But that doesn't mean you can't go on with our folk. We're all Jock Thompson's bairns. And whatever happens over the next 20 years, I would hope that would bide true, that would still have a strong Scottish society and would still have the feeling, both internally and as far as the whole world's concerned, that we're all Jock Thompson's bairns.
We do want ordinary nation statehood, and there is no threat to England containing this at all, absolutely none. But it isn't compatible with the maintenance of the Great British thing. Refusing this is not narrow, bigoted, backward-looking nationalism at all. On the contrary, I would argue that it's forward-looking in the sense of embracing the general state of affairs towards which globalisation is tending.
The idea that countries, having been part of a larger unit, still want to express their own identity and control their own affairs is not confined to Scotland. It's an international feeling. The number of renewed independent countries is very large. It's not something rare and strange. It's normal. It's part of what's been happening in the modern world.
This should be therefore encouraged and allowed to happen decently and democratically. The sooner we get on with it, the better.
I think we can be a very special society. We will have our faults, I'm quite sure of that. But I'm also sure we've got the ability to correct them where we must and to learn lessons where we should. So I think Scotland can be a very, very special place.
Scotland will always be a very special place, whose future will be determined by you, my brother and sister Scots, from Maidenkirk to Johnny Groats and beyond. I'll leave you with the voices of people engaged in the cause of Scottish independence and with the millenarian vision of the founder of the National Party of Scotland, Hugh MacDiarmid, who wrote, "For we hae faith in Scotland's hidden poors, the present's theirs, but all the past and future's ours."
I inherited the sense that Scotland can only really achieve the potential in the world if we are running our own affairs. I mean, that seems to me to be a self-evident truth.
I think it can either go very fast and will happen very soon, or it could be derailed and will take a generation. I think it will happen.
We just keep going as we've done for all these years. We don't listen to all these scaremongerings. I just believe it, it's in me. I can't believe anything else.
I think we might still have hard times. We might even have losses. We might have to push the boulder uphill again. But it'll happen. Of that, I'm quite convinced. Full independence.